Harvard Divinity School.
Catholicism as Movement, Affective Histories and Political Life Forms, March 6, 2024.
Good afternoon and welcome to this Gnoseologies event. My name is Giovanna Parmigiani and I'm the host of this series organized with the Transcendence and Transformation Initiative at the CSWR here at Harvard Divinity School. This series focuses on ways of knowing that are often labeled as non-rational, traditionally referred to as gnosis in Western philosophical and religious traditions, and often understood in contraposition to science. These ways of knowing are becoming more and more influential in contemporary societies, popular culture, and academic research. What is the place of spirit possession, divination, and experiences perceived as out of the ordinary in our lives? How can we study and approach this type of phenomena? Going beyond dichotomies such as body and mind, ordinary and extraordinary, reason and experience, and matter and spirit, this series will host scholars of different disciplines and practitioners interested in exploring and expanding the boundaries of what counts as knowledge today. So today I have the honor and pleasure to be here with Professor Valentina Napolitano. Hi, Valentina. Valentina is a professor at the University of Toronto and a Connaught Scholar. Her interdisciplinary journey bridges various thresholds of sensorial experiences, places, and histories. She's the author of multiple monograph and edited collections, including Migrant Hearts and The Atlantic Return, Migration, Mujercitas, a Medicine Man Living in Urban Mexico, The Anthropology of Catholicism, a Reader, and Theopolitics in of the Americas, as well as the work on Pope Francis as a Criollo Pope. Her current work is on mysticism and political theology, borderlands, and holy infrastructures. And today, Valentina and I will have a conversation on Catholicism as a movement, affective histories, and political life forms. We will engage themes on contemporary Catholicism, focusing on the Atlantic Return, Pope Francis, and migrants' immobility, highlighting the heart as political, historical, and affective life forms. This conversation will present multiple aspects of Professor Napolitano's current research, and among others, modes of academic practice that explore unknowing and epistemic humility in attending to ethnographic, political, theopolitical, and religious dynamics, the divine and social justice. Thank you, Valentina, for being here, and welcome to HDS.
Thank you to you. Can you hear me? Thanks to you, Dr. Parmigiani, if I can call you Giovanna. I just want to,
of course,
to really thank you. Thank you all to organize this, and also, first of all, to sort of acknowledge that we are on the Turtle Island here, in North America, as it is called in First Nations. So I acknowledge you that we are at different places. I acknowledge all the First Nation of this land and the possibility to work in kind of creative way over this land, because I am, and some of us are settler, and so I'm very grateful to the possibility of working on this land. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Valentina, for the acknowledgement. So I always start from backstories because I'm curious, and I maybe never ask you this. Valentina and I know each other, so we can drop the titles and call each other by name, first name. How did you become interested in anthropology and also doing fieldwork in Latin America and Italy? What's your story behind it?
Well, the stories are always sort of personal and then also geopolitical, I think. I grew up in the 1980s in Italy, just at the end of what they were called the lead years, and, where there was a lot of activism of different forms of the left to be engaged. And I started to read a lot of liberation theology at the time, and always had this kind of draw to Mexico as a place, but also Mexico as a revolutionary, the 1917 revolution, and kind of indigeneity. So that was kind of my point of entry, I would say, liberation theology. And then I happened to do something very different. I was studying economics in Milan and having a life crisis. So a lot of time anthropologists have life crisis and they become anthropologists through life crisis. And then I realized much later that political economy, it's so connected as well to what is called religion. And in a way, funny enough, I come back to that interest in economics right now, and coming a little bit, if not full circle, but really, and then kind of expanded. I should say also that one of the central focus when I was working for my first ethnography in Guadalajara in Western Mexico was what was the movement of what they call the comunidades eclesiales de base, the ecclesia-based communities, which was the end process at the time of liberation theology. And central to them were the Jesuit order. So following the Jesuit, which has often been an interesting path, I then went to Rome and followed some of them and followed some of the migrants I knew, and then kind of took place, kind of expanded in that kind of work that has been the kind of Atlantic return. I don't know, shall I show some of the pictures now?
Of course. If you have pictures, we're always very happy to see images.
Yeah. So I just wanted to very briefly kind of, I often start with this kind of pictures to think about Benedict the Moor. So to think how Catholicism as movement is very much on one level trans-Mediterranean. And I wanted people to notice here that he's got soccer cleats in this.
Yes.
I don't know if you can see it. And so that, by the way, brought me to another work that I did quite recently, a couple of years ago, about young kings, about the figure of, some of you may not know at all, but this is called Marcus Rashford, and it's a very famous Manchester United player. And so kind of, which I will mention a little bit later, in this conversation, is the idea of kind of theopolitics, but we'll come more later to that. But really, I wanted to draw the attention to this group of people meeting here today in this conversation, that Catholicism and religion in particular has a lot to do with the politics and with sports as well. I think that political figures and the way in which the charisma of sport figures right now, especially in Europe and the United States, is coming to the fore, needs to be studied also via theological and religious tenets. So in that sense, I wanted to bring that to attention. And then, just kind of mentioning the first falling in love with Mexico in a way, and with theology of liberation, and thinking also, I was very drawn to the fact that we needed to rethink what we call in anthropology the study of subjectivity, the subject, the person, the personhood, which is also central to what theologians call anthropological theology, more in kind of pontifical institutes, and as kind of anthropologists, social cultural anthropologists are very interested in the study of personhood. And that really what he drawn me to think about the relation between, for example, the church, Catholicism, the way in which gender, activism, but also migration come into place, internal migration to Mexico at the time, and really thinking through what I call the prism of belonging. So thinking how people are composed of history, are composed of movement. In a way, identity is distributed affectively in space. What does that mean? It means that we do not understand people as kind of with the modern idea of the subject, which is an independent, autonomous subject, but we more understand people in relations as formed in relations, and part also of life cycles. And so in that sense, I was already expanding or anticipating the study of what Raymond Williams, introduced with the study of structure of feelings. I was actually talking about structure of feeling and the residual and the emergent. That would be later on taken up by the affective turn in theory, in social theory, in cultural theory, which is this idea that affects are very important. Affects are transmitted in space. One of the key difference between emotion and affects. I mean, some people may use, emotions to talk about affects, but the way in which in anthropology we work with that is that we think that in a way affects are also impersonal. They are transmitted in space. They belong to a third space. They have an energy. They have a vitality. So how do we study? They are part of the pre-social, and yet they are real. They are part of the real. They are part of the real. So I was studying the beginning of the affective turn and kind of reflecting upon that. And then that kind of drew me into this other work, the migrant's heart and the affective return. So what does it mean to, if I could put it in a way that actually the late Saba Mahmood, also a good friend, put it at the time, what does it mean to live a faith that has lost its civilizational mission? So what is that? How it is to study a lived, vital faith that is not a civilization missionary encounter. And that's why the Atlantic Return is about Catholic subjects from Latin America living in Rome. So working in the caring industry, working in, very sometimes, de-skilled, feminized, and be part of a church, be part of a Catholic church if you want to think from the bottom up. And so what is that encounter between the center and the periphery, so-called, and the revitalization of Catholicism in Europe, which at one level has been considered for a very long time, for quite a while, and also by Pope Francis, as a grandfather, a grandmother who is dying in a way and needs to be revitalized from within. Well,
we'll get to that. Thanks, Valentina. Sorry, we'll get to that in a minute. I just want to flag here how important has been your ethnographic fieldwork in shaping your interest. It looks to me that from your early starts in economics, and really could not expect that, really, that was something, very interesting about you that I didn't know. How it appears to me, at least, that your engagement with the field and with your interlocutors really led you somehow towards some questions and not others. Because, if someone, approached this conversation as, let's look at how theology and anthropology, work today into studying Catholicism, we have to underline, I think, the fact that this is not theoretical. This comes from very practical and very affectively and emotional and bodily engagement with you and your interlocutors, right? It's not something that, question you were but probably interested in abstract, but came out of relationships. Do you want to talk, before going to migrant hearts, and I'm looking forward to going to that, and theopolitics, and how do you think this is important, why this is important for anthropology? Can you tell us something about your fieldwork, how it's for you to be on the field? What about your affective and personal engagement with the field, how it led you to the question that you eventually tried to tackle?
Yeah, well, first of all, I would say that fieldwork is not just practicing vis-a-vis theory, but actually fieldwork is theory in action. I would say this absolutely. Let's ethnography perform the theory. That's will be my point, and point of many, especially people engaged, for example, in anthropology, colleague students engaged in anthropology of Catholicism. So there isn't a distinction between theory and even critical theory in a way, and kind of fieldwork, because fieldwork, if you think about it, is also the constant rekindling with the otherwise, with the unknown, with the other originally as a missionary practice. Lots of people, people think that one of the inception of anthropology has been the kind of encounter with the New World and the missionary practice of the early Jesuit and Franciscan. But it's very much how we also theorize through as theory becomes an activation. And so to give you an example here, which is actually comes, what does it mean spiritual kinship? Sorry, kinship, no, but citizenship. Yes, interesting slippage. Which came out exactly of some of the work of the migrants' art in Atlantic Return. So you here have an example here of a so-called brotherhood, Catholic brotherhood called the Señor de los Milagros, which is the Lord of the Miracles. And this is how they carry this. You can see a little bit here as well. This Lord of the Miracle, which is this very heavy sedan, through the streets of Rome up to St. Peter. And, you know, once a year or a couple of times a year, but once particular. And it's a way in which this kind of migrant devotees, who are often, part of them are documented and part are undocumented, they can be in a public space where they also carry the Lord. So what does it mean ethnographically carrying the Lord? And so I looked at practices of not touching the sedan, the idea of the hands. I started from the hand. Why do you start from the hand? And one of the kind of interesting ways in which people talk to me and I observe, and I was participating in this kind of carrying the sedan. I wasn't carrying the sedan, I was part of the group, as you see here, is the Lord of the Miracle. You know, quite a lot of people behind this sedan carry toward St. Peter. You know, often work, for example, on the caring industry, which requires, for example, to caring for the elderly, to care for the sick. And it's a type of work which is also considered, inverted comma, feminized, inverted comma. And therefore, your hands have to be soft. You cannot show, for example, that you're working on, you know, a construction buildings. A way in which this kind of masculinity is portrayed back home in Peru. So by looking at the softness of the hand that kind of cannot touch, you know, they have to carry with their shoulders, not really touching it, but carrying with their shoulder, because the hands are also impure. They are pure and impure. One of the classic way in which anthropologists also look at kind of matter out of place. And so the interesting way in which I sort of follow these people, and they were talking about, you know, I have a spiritual citizenship, soy un ciudadano del espíritu. And I was thinking, here you have a secular idea of citizenship, and here you have a spiritual idea of citizenship, which is performed in space, is affectively transmitted in space. It's the idea that you surrender to the Lord of the Miracle by carrying it. And this surrendering gives you a spiritual citizenship. So you see, then you begin to theorize what is citizenship. And we got very secular categories of citizenship. And of course, I'm not saying that the states do not exist. Absolutely, people have to do that process of documenting and, you know, bureaucratization. But also you can open the register of citizenship to, you know, a theological religious dimension through fieldwork. But you need to be there.
The prism of belonging that you were mentioning before, that informed your research. It's very clear in this example how, you know, there are multiple belongings that do different things. And I really liked a lot, actually, that you mentioned ethnography as anthropology theory in action, because I think there's, I'm talking to the students here among the audience, that there's a different, there are different ways to understand ethnography in different disciplines, right? As a qualitative method, it's used in different disciplines right now. But I think that some engage the field, so to speak, with some strong ideas about, you know, what they want to find in the field, and then they find them, right? Because of course, that's a filter that you use, and you're gonna see some of the things you're interested in. But there are other ways to engage ethnography. The one I learned, the one you taught me, and the one that you are practicing that actually sees things the other way around, you know? It's just, you know, from that engagement emerges your theories, some theories, challenges to theories, challenges to your ideas, the constantly making, doing and doing of your place, of your ideas and your presence as an ethnographer. So thank you. This is a very, very important example that I think it's a great transition between, your ethnographic experience and your interest actually in sovereignty, in political theology, in theopolitics. Can you tell us a bit more about that part of your work as well?
To sort of transition to that, I have to mention somebody that for me has been fundamental, has been like, I wish I'd met him in person, with Michel de Certeau. I'm one of those anthropologists, theorists, literary critics who has really been, I'm very grateful to his work. Absolutely, has been fundamental for me. Because one of the things for anthropology is about, well, he thinks about his thoughts and around history and historiographies. So also how, and heterologies, the world is speaking of the other. So how social culturally we can always find ways through ethnography, through histories, way to engage with the subjectivity, the words, the voices that are present, but they are not part of the hegemonic construct. What does that mean? That we can trace, like we can do that work where we can attend, which is also political work. We can attend to that which is obliterated, trace like, fading away. And by that, we can really pay attention, sociologically speaking, for example, at that which has been marginalized. And so de Certeau, by the way, via Henri de Lubac has been very important as well for Pope Francis. So you can really begin to see also theologically this ways in which we can't really separate anthropology from critical theory, from theology, from geopolitical issues that are happening now. That kind of combination, and via particular figures, and that's what probably very briefly I mentioned some of the work done on Pope Francis that I've done. I've always been very interested, exactly as an apex of the Atlantic return. Because what the Atlantic return does, or the Americas, if you think about the Americas going back to the center, one of the center, Rome, the Vatican, one of the center of Catholicism, is to contribute to its renovation and also to the undoing of its force. So if you think about the figure of Pope Francis, and you think about now, what's happening now with Pope Francis, it's extremely interesting, who is considered to be a radical renovator and a nearly heretic. I mean, I can use this in public, but we know this tension, which is exactly this idea that it's part of this idea that I develop in some work of thinking about Pope Francis as a criollo pope. What is criollo? What is criollismo in the America? Think about Simón Bolívar. Simón Bolívar was technically a criollo. So the son of people born in the kind of metropolis, Spain and the metropolis, as, Pope Francis was, of direct Italian descent and born in the colonies. So this idea of criollos is those ideas of people who have been radical people, revolutionary people as well, who have transformed the nation state, or transform the affective relation to what they guide, the pastoral, the kind of national crowd, but also they comply to certain forms of traditionalism. So they are revolutionary and traditionalist at the same time. That Simón Bolívar still believes on a nation state, the Pan-American nation state. Pope Francis is a criollo pope, still is part of a Petrine descent. And yet, with this idea of embracing, the horizontal embracing of theologies, and the way in which, de Certeau also pays attention to the peripheries. Remember 2013, the first thing that he did, he went to Lampedusa. He went to Lampedusa as he draws the attention to a documented migration in the Trans-Mediterranean.
And so I just add for the audience that might not be acquainted with what happens in Lampedusa, because it's very far away from here. So it's a little island south of Italy where those who try to come from Northern Africa through the Mediterranean to Europe as migrants, undocumented migrants, to save their lives, often are let's say hosted in a kind of camp sort of situation before they are there, recent the southern shore of the Mediterranean, where they come from, of course, with all the problems that come with it, or they are integrated within politics of refugees and migrants inclusions in the EU. But it's a very difficult camp, like really space and place in the Mediterranean. There are tragic deaths every year in the Mediterranean from migrants trying to make it to the other side. Sorry, a little in brackets.
Absolutely, completely right to think about. And what perhaps very briefly I wanted to mention is that anthropologists, that particularly like me, were very interested in critical Catholic studies, we study materialities as well. That's where it becomes really important also theologically. So like a cross of Lampedusa, what is called, is formed or was constructed out of the wood of shipwrecks arriving in Lampedusa. So the idea of carrying trace like potency and affectivity of people dying on the boats, or kind of try to find, because also people were not just from Christian backgrounds, Muslim, very many different backgrounds, but that kind of orientation to the divine. The journey is also a divine journey. And people like Stefania Pandolfo, quite well-known anthropologist, but also other wonderful young anthropologists like Iqbal Bassett, Hira McMaster, working on tribulation and Islam. They really think what is the very interesting anthropological rendering of doing fieldwork and thinking the theological orientation that inform the life of people. And so thinking about the materiality of those crosses in the context in which they were, mobilized as well to sort of seducing people into moving into action, do something around this. And also all the problems to do, with being a very Christian, iconography. But we followed the material, the affective materials, with the affectivity of the material traces. That's what anthropologists do at their best, and how they contribute very much to the study also of what is called exactly one of the fields that is emerging. And this is some of the work that I've done with Carlotta McAllister, but also with Jennifer Shepherd-Hughes, with Marie-Josée Diabreu, I wanted to mention today in particular somebody called Professor Rafael Sanchez, who passed away very recently, who wrote about theopolitics, dancing with the Jacobite in Venezuela. And really interested in that, rethinking sovereignty. So rather than thinking sovereignty connected to, the church from, the vertical church, the idea of Carl Schmitt, and this idea that there is a way in which the state and the church are very similar, so that what he calls secularized idea about the states are very theological ideas about Christianity, put it in a simple way. And thinking from below, so thinking about ways in which theopolitics, through the study of sensorial spaces, affective spaces, the return of the dead, like the elements, which is something that Gnoseologies, your kind of this series is very interested. So when we think even the alchemical dimension of the elements can be thought about creating different forms of sovereignties, which are often multiples. They are not vertical and universal, but they are sort of singulars in a way and immanent, and really allows us to think in a much more broader way beyond a straight jacketing of the original ideas of political theologies, and be in conversation with it. So I'm not saying theopolitics is opposite to political theology. No, it's a development within the debates, within the opening up, within the intersectional and interdisciplinary conversation about the relation between politics, theologies, and forms of life. And so, there are work that we've done in Toronto. For a few years, we had an initiative called Entangled World, Sovereignty, Sanctity, and Soil with Professor Simon Coleman here, but also, continue to work on that. And again, working on Pope Francis, who is theopolitical in certain ways, because he's maybe I'll talk later if people want to, this example, or maybe I can talk now. This example of what I called and study as the touch event. So how touching, again, as a sensorial space, is also a theological charged space. And how we think about touch events as being theopolitical. So what does that mean? And I'm giving an example of a small incident that happened, but got particular mediatic reverberation. So it was picked up by the media, especially in, around Rome and the Vatican, which was a visit of Pope Francis in Loreto in Italy in 2019. For this particular moment, an ethnographic moment, he, the fisherman rings, which is this ring that the popes have, which is really, it's also a symbol of the grace received, of being the officius or officium and the officant of the Petrine mandate, if I can call it like that. So being a descendant of St. Peter, to be on that line. So this ring is very important. It's just worn. It is worn in particular occasion. And there is a moment in which a devotee is kind of really want to kiss that ring. And you have a moment and Pope Francis withdraws the hand. And I call it that I study as a touch event, that withdrawal, because it's in the moment of the withdrawal, the oscillation of making the God present and a certain form of God, so a Petrine descent, also an idea of Catholic humanity as a certain idea of kind of a pontifical gravitas, and Pope Francis not recognizing himself into that form of devotion, if you want, which is also perhaps connected to an ultra-mundane, like a very sort of idea of, how would I put it in a certain language, that, a kind of conservative was idea, vertical idea of the pontificate. Instead, we know that is a pope that has also been very interested in horizontal embracing. So there is that moment, and that moment get mediatized. Everybody start to take pics and, like flashes. And so what's happening in that moment? And I call it a touch event because it's theopolitical. There is a different forms of the church emerging in that ethnographic moment. There is a moment of withdrawal. There's a moment of refusal. So just to give you an idea of what it is working ethnographically and theopolitically from the ground up. So again, I wanted to, and perhaps I may shall I give also some other example of?
No, of course. I just want to just be sure that all the audience is on the same board when we talk about theopolitics, what we are talking about, just to make sure. I think the examples, now that you explain us this touch moment, this ethnographic moment, I think it will be easier for all of us to better situate a kind of, commentary on what you mean by theopolitics, because I think that most of us can be aware about political theology, but there's a particular way for you to understand political theology that I think it's meaningful for current Catholic studies, but also anthropological studies. So if you want to say a little more about that, then we go into another example. Thank you, Valentina.
Yeah, you're right. I glossed over actually to explain what it was about. Thank you, Giovanna. And, it really started through, thinking theologically, actually, and through a political theology of this kind of oscillation between the idea that we can name God, we can have what is called a cataphatic in the kind of theological terms, so that gods can be given a name, that can have attribute, that can be potent, can be graceful, can be, And another tradition of theologies, which is what we call the apophatic theology, the idea that we constantly give names, but those names are not enough. The naming of God is always a human performance, and therefore is always provisional, is always limited. It's important because what it does, this theology is constantly requiring us, the human and the multi-species in a way as well, to try to give a name, although the name is never that. And I think that conundrum between giving a name and not giving a name, giving a law and the law always be provisional, create an oscillation, create a space that anthropologically, it's very interesting because you can study in space and time. So you can study when people claim this law is the law of the land, it's given by God, and the contestation of certain people or certain constituency or certain even multi-species, where that law is not final, always need to be rekindled, needs to be reapprehended. So that space between the law, the making of the law, and the undoing of the law is the theopolitical moment. So you can just imagine how even in geopolitical spaces now, we can think about the Palestine and Israel conflict, which is one of the many, where you have in both realms the invocation often of the connection between the land and the God, or you can have a certain theopolitical but also neo-populist discourse of this also with, Trump grammars that you are anointed, you are a godlike figure, you are anointed by God. It's a particular form of theopolitics as well. So wanted to say that theopolitics is not always liberatory. It can also be appropriated for, I would say, especially neo-populist movement. So in that moment in which there is a relation to the law and this kind of language of the God, law, and the land, you have ways in which we can study that as a theopolitical event that can disrupt a certain continuity of the state or can avail it as well. So
that's a fantastic explanation.
Yeah, and I
Sorry.
wanted to say that we ethnographically, sensorially. So we study, for example, the movement that Trump does, the invocation of the words, the tautology use. It is what it is, like the repetition rather than the deepening of a meaning. So a lot of kind of theopolitical moment of Trump's are repeating the same thing. So the message is the repetition, is the Marie-José de Abreu has written this beautiful work called The Charismatic Gymnasiums. It will call the tautology of the charismatics that oscillate. So the meaning is the oscillation. So just the kind of the opening, the exciting opening that there is for anthropology and fieldworks to really open up and open up the fields and be in conversation of let's the ethnography perform the theory and let's the ethnography perform the theological.
That's a fantastic explanation, and I want just to flag that this a theopolitical oscillation makes space for, as we said, dissertors, space for marginality, obviously, and as a scholar of magic, of course, I place my work within this discourse in that margins, right? But also make space for different theologies, like in the example of Pope Francis that you make before, that allow this prism of belonging or spiritual citizenship to emerge through ethnographic practice, but also I think allows for non-representational somehow ways of knowing, like the affective, like the material, and possibly maybe for us anthropologists also allow us to embrace non-representational ways to deal with the knowing, the anthropological theory of knowing. Just, flagging this because I will have a conversation with Paul Stoller in a couple of weeks, and I want to trace a connection between, this type of work and more non-representational ways to engage also with ethnographic writing and anthropological writing. But this is on the side. And again, I think I really like that you mentioned the ambivalence, right, of theopolitical perspectives that allow, neopopulism to emerge. This is what I observe in my fieldwork, for example, if I think about ways of knowing, because it's really an epistemological also, has epistemological implications, the type of work that you're doing on theopolitics. That it can also bring, about some problematic aspects, but also it can bring about different ways, as in the, spiritual citizenship example that you make, ways of belonging that in the Italian context, the context of migrants, in the European context of migration, can really represent spaces of empowering spaces, right? So, yeah, having said this, I'm ready to jump into another example. I think it would be easier for us to follow.
Maybe I want to say one thing that comes to you for the North American audience. If you think about the importance of the relation between race and religion, which is, one of the debate, which is really central, I would say, in North America. And in Europe, it will be religion and migration, that kind of tension that sometimes, one has to explain. The place that race has in some debates in North America is the space that migration will have in certain debates, to just sort of keep that in mind. The debate on race is not the same in Europe, but there are lots of parallel. And another things that perhaps I wanted to say, and past this one, and then probably I'll come back if I have time to the Detroit example, which I will. It's if I hope, but it's exactly the questions of unknowing. This is where my current work is, which is on mysticism and politics. And I just started again from an example to give you an idea of what I'm working on right now. Kehinde Wiley, that I'm sure a lot of you will know. It's the official portrait painter of Obama. And he has had a wonderful exhibition called The Archaeology of Silence, and San Francisco is just turning around. And this is one of his paintings. Probably it's not very good here, my reproduction. My work in a very simple way, and now I say it in a very cryptic, but also provocational perhaps way, is to put this work, which is actually reverberated with the martyr of Tarcisius, a kind of 2nd century martyr. So it takes inspiration from early Christian iconography with Our Lady of Sorrow. This is a representation in kind of Spain of Our Lady of Sorrow. So what it is about the piercing of the body, what is about the vulnerability of the body laid open, that really allows us to think about the relation between mysticism and politics. Because my point, and other people have been working also on that, I think there is a group of us, really very exciting group of people working on this. The problem with subjectivity and identity politics in 21st century. The entrenchment of this idea of belonging and idea of identity, identifying. I think for me, and that's what I'm working on, is that there is a rich archives where these questions of relinquishing identity, it's present in Catholicism and quite in Christianity, but in Catholicism in particular. So what does it mean to undo identity? And my point is that before imagining a new world, I mean, now we are in a geopolitical moment in which the questions of the crisis, the tribulation, the end of the world, the apocalypse, the catastrophe, which is very important, has been a lingering, and some people, very, very well, Mayra Rivera, discussing that the catastrophe has been ongoing for a lot of people from different perspectives in the world, especially from the Caribbean. So there is nothing new about this. But what I think it's very important is to not throw away the baby with the bathwater. I.e., there is quite a richness in the mystical archives in Christianity, iconographically and textually and in experiences, that can be reconjoined to the violence of the body and to the capacity or the beginning capacity of disimagining the world before imagining it again. I know I sound perhaps very opening up.
I think actually for this, the audience of Gnoseologies, this is actually a very important connection point to the type of work we do. How I'm also interested from the magical point of view, so at the margins of monotheism. And I want just to mention that when I mention multiple theologies, are including non-monotheistic theologies, right, into the space of this conversation. So we're not talking only about Christianity here, we are expanding. So, but for those of like me who work at the margin of monotheism within Western society, of course, what we call gnosis, that of course has what you might call mysticism, have the potential of, undoing, as you say, but also imagining an otherwise somehow today in the 21st century. So I think that we are working along parallel lines here, and you of course within the Catholic tradition and mysticism, and what me and others are trying to do is trying to let other non-mainstream modernities, the consequences, the impacts of non-mainstream modernities in Europe, what have brought us to, and how we can work with those. So absolutely, I'm very excited about your future project, as much as I'm excited about your work on theopolitics. Thank you for this. Are there any questions? Is the audience very shy today? If you have questions, please rather than Q&A. So I would love to hear more about Santi Migranti, but you mentioned you have a Detroit example that makes it closer to home.
Detroit, exactly. Detroit, there is some work which has already come out and some work which is in press with comparative study in society and history that I've done with a team, a fantastic team, co-researcher of Stephen Berquist and Elizabeth Rigotti. And we've been going to Detroit for a while, which has been really interesting in the understanding Detroit as a borderland space. So the Windsor side, so the Canadian US borderland. And we've been very interested in thinking about the Catholic Church as a receding and emerging infrastructure. So what does it mean to talk about holy infrastructures? And that's the kind of work that we have been doing and publishing soon. And so I just wanted to sort of flag again some sort of concrete example to think about that. And what does it mean, a whole infrastructure? We have been thinking about the elements. So following earth, air, in particular earth, air, and water in the particular work that is coming out. And thinking the way in which the Catholic Church can be thought about an infrastructure that had to manage those elements as part of a municipality of Detroit and part of an archdiocese, of course. And at the same time, these elements have a theological potency. And how do we understand the management of these theological potencies together with a kind of urbanities in transformation and a policy of the territoriality together with the policy of the archdioceses? And what we have come to realize is that the Catholic Church has been allowing and interrupting certain flows. So the flows of the elements is fundamental to understand how the Catholic Church emerges as a holy infrastructure and as allowing or preventing, if you want, a work around race. So in a way, how to racialize in very divisive way, as well as to working toward releasing, helping this racialization to go beyond that. So I just give some examples. This is from Santo Toribio Romo, which is a kind of very important kind of saint for the Mexican migrants kind of going across the US-Mexican border. And this is a very contested icon. And so we follow the history of how this icon is produced and how it is enthroned in the Church of Holy Redeemer in Mexico Town. And I can just show you this. Why was this is this one of the placard that you get at the US-Mexican border to say, be careful, family crossing, and how contested it was, this image, when it was enthroned at the moment, which is enthroned during the Obama period, by the way. So we look at that. So there is a materiality of the icon that we unravel. This is the Black polished Christ in the Seminary of the Sacred Heart in Detroit. And this is a history that told at the time of this kind of in 1967 riots or revolutions or whatever you want to call the racial clashes that happened in Detroit. People went over the fence and painted black the polished Christ, and then it was repainted white, painted black, painted white. So the history now, the kind of history, the stories, is that then it was left as a black-faced Pope, face Christ with the white robe. So again, you know, how these materialities become the knot of traces of this racialized history. And here, I mean, this is like central to the work that we've done in the Church of the Grotto in Detroit, which is one of the center of Tridentine Latin masses. And this is the tomb to the unborn fetus. I've written it proper way. Yeah, probably is. Whatever, there's a misspelling, whatever. But and so the idea and the ethnography around Via Crucis and the interesting way in which, and especially now with the Wade and Roe and the incredible strong debates around abortion and the right to choose in the United States and across the world right now in many different places, we could really see that through the prism of the way in which these Tridentine devotees really were thinking that there was something quite evil by the act of abortion. And so they had to memorialize with a tomb in soil, the tomb of the unborn child, as they call it, on the unborn fetus. So this idea that the earth, the soil, could be conquered by non-Catholic spaces if we allowed abortion. So thinking about the soil, how it is mobilized, you know, you would think what the soil has to do with studying Catholicism or studying, you know, theology. Well, there's a lot to do with that. And we need to understand how people live it through their daily lives, through their rituals, through their way in which the soil is a potency and also is a problem. So it's a problem to manage. You know, in Detroit, you have, you know, roots of trees who are coming out when they should not. And, you know, you have a nature which comes back and disrupt infrastructures of, you know, the impermanency of infrastructure, of the urbanities in transformation, and that soil that can contain the potency of, you know, a battle against the evilness, as it is perceived, of course, by, you know, the people we engage in ethnography. So again, you know, how do we open that space of understanding and conversation? I hope it was helping.
No, absolutely. It was very, very useful. And it brought me to mind lots of work I've done with feminism and, you know, abortion rights in Italy. And, you know, I probably didn't touch on the theopolitical, you know, with goddess and, you know, feminine aspects of God. Thinking about that in your work, but, you know, we might not have time to touch on that, but would be a very nice direction to go to. I have a question. We have a question from the audience. Sorry?
Please. Yeah.
Go ahead. No, you want to add something?
With the second part of the synod now happening in Rome and the opening of the new Jubilee in 2025, the questions of not just women, but the sort of the potency of femaleness and, you know, the theological idea are central. So here you are.
I will have a conversation over coffee on that soon, Valentina. Then we have a question.
Sorry, I shouldn't do this. Is very unruly, but the work of Michela Murgia, who is this Italian theologian who died, has written this little book which has not been translated.
Ave Mary. It has.
No, God Save the Queer. Has it been translated?
Yes.
Very
No,
new.
I think
I hope it's going to get translated. Very interesting. Very, very, very interesting. Actually, if there is anybody in the audience who has the power to translate in the kind of, anything, it would be a very interesting female theologians and feminist theologian to the last work of her to translate. Yes.
No, absolutely. And she recently passed away as well. But she wrote very important books, theological books, as well as, novels.
Sharing
so
I can see the Q&A.
We have a question. How do you measure the holiness and value of certain holy artifacts and infrastructure? Who can verify and put a value to these items?
I think that the holiness is exactly this idea of how you host the divine and you're being hosted by that. So how certain forms of even kind of infrastructures can help or hinder the presence of the holy. So I give you an example of the Solanos Casey Center in Detroit, as some of the audience may know or may not know. But the Solano case is the beatified figure, and one of the first, really most important in the American sort of saint pantheon. And there is this very important pilgrimage center, which was recently redeveloped by an architectural firm with the kind of major donations of a devotee, of course. And we studied the way in which the new infrastructure was created in collaboration between the Capuchins, who kind of mastermind this center, and the architectural firm and the devotee. And so this idea that you had to circulate, the air had to circulate. So create an infrastructure, a new infrastructure, a new garden, a new main building, a new even shop where people had to finish off, passing through, where you have devotional things, where to position the main altar. It was a debate. The idea of circulation for creating a new infrastructure to therefore make the experience of the holy highlighted. So you see how this division between the religious and the secular infrastructure is very false, because you really have to anthropologically study the way in which architects are thinking about the redesigning of churches, of holy grounds, and how that is a conversation that takes place between religious orders, donors, and the devotees to enhance this experience of the holy. And one way of thinking in that particular case was the intensification of the flow. So also think the pneuma, the idea of the holy pneuma, not as something that is stuck, but something that needs to circulate. So I hope that kind of gives an example, complete example. Yeah, so let's work with architects.
That's fantastic, Valentina. I wish we had more time for this conversation. We'll continue sooner or later, I'm sure. And I hope we show to some students also how this framework or pair of glasses, as I say, of theopolitics can open up different interpretation practices, otherwises that might be interesting for the work. But I think we're over 1 o'clock, so it's time to wrap up. So thank you so much, Valentina. I love you so much. Thank you for your participation, for this wonderful conversation, for answering questions. And thank you all for having been here. Please stay tuned on the activities of the CSWR, the Transcendence and Transformation Initiative, and of course, Gnoseologies. You can find this information on the CSWR website. and that you can find in the chat, and also I see in the shared screen, including the registration for our next Gnoseologies event. It will be on March 27th at 1 p.m. with Professor Paul Stoller. As I said before, we will talk about his last book, Wisdom from the Edge, and sensory ethnography and how to write ethnographic insights for a wider audience as well. So thank you all for having me with us, and have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Sponsor, Center for the Study of World Religions.
Copyright 2024, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.